Okay, got it.
Really. Okay, I think it's recording now. Okay, good. So hello everybody, welcome to the Doomer Optimism podcast. I am the host today, and I have two guests, Andy Shagbark Hick Adirondacker and Keturah Lamb. You know them both, I believe, from hanging around Doomer Optimism circles, but I'm going to have them first give us a little life update, and then we're going to talk this episode about nomadism, which has been something Andy's been posting a ton about. Like what would a future oriented nomadism look like? So we're going to talk about that, but first let's hear an update from you guys. What's up with you?
Well, I just want to say, Ashley, first, because you're saying our names, you can call me Andy Hickman now because I'm almost out of the military. It's almost over. So
Okay.
You can use my
Okay,
last
good.
name. I'm fixing to do that. And speaking of my last name, Keturah is going to have it by spring because I asked her to marry me and she said yes just about 3 weeks ago. So
I'm so excited. Congratulations, you guys. That's so lovely. Oh my gosh. This is like the best Twitter love story. Okay, and when are you getting married? Spring?
Yeah, sometime in the spring. We don't have an exact date yet because we got to tell all of our family still. There's like, I have a lot of family and he has a lot of family, and we want to tell them all before we like actually set a date.
Yes. Okay. Sounds good. So we will make sure to not publish this until everyone in the family knows, so that Twitter doesn't get to know before.
Okay.
You could. I wouldn't care. No,
our family's not going to watch us.
No, my half my family doesn't even know how to use a computer or anything. So yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's so exciting. Keturah, I know that you like mend wedding dresses. Are you making your own?
Oh yeah, I am making my own wedding dress completely from scratch. I'd already been working on it for several months before I met Andy. And I have a lot of progress done, thankfully, because what I've already got done, I would not have been able to do around him because it was very detailed work. And now I pretty much just have like construction stuff left, which is nice. I still have a lot of detailed, I'm doing a lot of tatting and stuff still. He's unfortunately got to see some of the tatting that's happening, but he won't get to see the finished project until I'm actually wearing it.
Good. Oh, that's so exciting. Yeah. I'm so happy for you guys. That's so cool. It's gonna be so fun. You guys are such a match made in heaven. Okay, so let's start with this concept of nomadism. I guess I could just briefly say from my perspective, to me, I've always kind of thought of these two poles of like settled society and nomadic society. And like throughout human history, human civilization, there's always been these like nomadic people that would orbit around settled society, sometimes extract from settled society or live on the margins of it. And there was often an oppositional relationship between the two. Civilized people don't really like nomads and vice versa. And so, yeah, that's kind of the background. And then one other thing that I just want to mention before I let you guys talk a little bit about nomadism is listening to, I think it was Andy, James Pogue, and Joey Keegan on Gord's podcast. James said something along the lines of like, America legalized barbarism or something like that. And I thought that it was really interesting to think of the role of American civilization in sort of like allowing for a nomadic subculture to flourish. So I want to touch on those points. We don't have to like dig into either of them deeply right now, but just to start, I guess let's just start thinking about like, what are you drawn to with a nomadic life? You know, what does it represent to you? What, you know, how would you define it? And then we can go from there.
Well, I've said it a lot of different times, different places, a degree of genetic inevitability in doing it and traveling. I think there's probably some people who have a predisposition. They're not raised to do it. They're probably pre-programmed out of the womb to want to wander. And I even think there's a lot of people who are that way who you don't realize they're that way. Like, why are some Irishmen drunks and others not? that some of those Irishmen who are drunks they might have traveler blood, like the Irish travelers, that ethnic group in the Celtic Isles, and they might not even know that it's possible to travel, and so they might shoehorn themselves into fixed, settled society, and it's so miserable for them that they drink themselves to death. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of weird little textured anthropologies that are sort of obscure, that you wouldn't see at first, that might show us some nomadic impulse in a lot of different groups of people. And as far as the oppositional relationship goes, it's certainly true that the majority of human beings on Earth today are sedentary, almost exclusively because of the forcible inclusion of nomads into settled society, and the conquest of lands where nomads exist. It's been very few regions of the Earth where there's still a significant population of nomads. There certainly isn't even a billion, much less a half a billion of nomads. Its range is probably below, from what I've read, probably below 15 million different people in the world who are doing this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, the forcible nature of it, I think, is notable, though, because it sort of shows that people are not going to voluntarily. Some people are not going to voluntarily give this sort of a lifestyle up, but settled society will attempt to build social architecture to foreclose the possibility of nomadism, and therefore if you elect to do it, you will be at odds with settled society, and they will target you, and you'll sort of have to be an outlaw.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really interesting, because I think it does seem kind of unidirectional. Like, settled society wants to forcibly integrate nomads or travelers, but not the other way around. Like, the nomads aren't going into civilized society and really trying to recruit them out. And if I think about even something like hitchhiking in the US, there's all these rules about it. There's all these laws, like, or train hopping, that make it really difficult to just kind of travel around. There's, you have to follow the laws of the civilized society, even if you're sort of apart from it. Keturah, just briefly, your thoughts on this topic before we dig a little deeper.
Yeah. I guess I have, I agree with what Andy said. I never would have thought about it before he said it. I mean, he said it before, but before I met him, like, he's talked about it that way. I think the things that attract me to life, though, that sort of life, is like the culture of it, and like meeting other like-minded folks, and like the hospitality of it. And you just don't really find that as much in civilized type structured settings. You can, and like, I've done my best to like make it a thing in like my own home, but when I travel, I definitely feel like there's more community, and there's more like of those fruits of the spirit that I like yearn to see, and like growing in my own life, and I see it in other families' lives more, where I just experience that on a deeper level. And I think it even like goes back into like the old prophets, like in the Old Testament, where like they were like traveling a lot, and just kind of like that way of like being a wayfaring pilgrim, which I guess you see in the New Testament too, but just like that idea of just being like the pilgrim who's going out there and experiencing all the blessings, the raw blessings of life that you're not really going to experience when you have a corporate lifestyle.
Yep. Okay, so this is interesting. So let's dig in on this topic of community, because I traveled quite a bit when I was in my early 20s, all around the world, and with my boyfriend at the time, and I felt like it was pretty lonely. Like, it was a pretty lonely existence traveling, because you don't have like sustained relationships. Like, there were points of contact with, if we did something like couch surfing, like, wow, look at the hospitality of people, but it wasn't like the same people that you sustained contact with through time. And then I read this book, which we can refer back to. It's Wandering God, by Morris Berman. And I was thinking about how, like, traditionally, and you talked about this a little bit, let's dig into it now. Nomadic people would be traveling together with a community, or you'd be traveling to the same places in your cycle each year. So you would be like coming back into like connection over the course of years in the same places. So let's like envision what that looks like, or talk about our experiences with it.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I've had a lot of experience with that.
Yeah.
That's mostly what I do. Is I have a few really eclectic type style communities that I travel a lot between. Some people would classify them as cults, and they probably are in certain circumstances. But if you're just like a nobody traveling to these different cults, you experience their hospitality without experiencing their toxic sides. And that's beautiful as a traveler. And I still end up having really great deep conversations with the people. And then oftentimes, like, I'll travel here, and then a friend's like, oh, I want to travel with you to the next place. And then you end up traveling with friends to different places. I've once I actually get to my first location, my first destination, I very rarely end up traveling alone after that. I end up being with people, and with the same people, and then I make last connections. Because we're in the 21st century and I have a cell phone, like, I talk to some of these people that I travel with like almost every day.
Yeah.
And Andy's seen that. I really do stay in contact with my friends and my traveling friends, and you do kind of like build a community. And I do try to have this fine line where I only use social media to stay connected with my friends. I try not to like scroll. I'm not really a scroller. I'm mostly like, I'll text friends and I'll call friends, and I'll post things and I'll see what my friends post, kind of like, but like try to make sure that it's like this good balance of actually staying connected to my in real life community, but not getting consumed with the technology part of it, but you allowing it to help me live the sort of lifestyle I wanted to stay connected to my community.
Yeah.
But also, on that same note, a lot of the people I've met because I was like scrolling through Facebook one day and I was like, oh, this family looks really interesting. So I messaged them like, can I come visit you? Like, I would say about 80% of the people I have visited and that I repetitively visit, I have visited through Facebook, and only 2 or 3 of the people I've ever visited is like, oh no, I've got to leave right away. Like, most of the people that I've found through Facebook this way were like great friends to me and I've stayed in contact with. And I've started doing that a little bit through Twitter, but I mostly have met people through Facebook.
That's so cool. Yeah, and I guess like starting to envision, like, maybe Andy, you can walk through like what is in the best case scenario. Paint us a picture of what like a fully fledged nomadic culture that includes families, that includes children. Like, what does it look like? What does it feel like? How does it practically work?
Well, I'll just highlight one difference between Keturah and I as a little background for my views on that, which is that I've had almost the opposite experience of Keturah, where, you know, as we get to know one another's world, she has all these people to show me, and I have places to show her. I have very few close associates in my life. That's the way that it's out for me. Completely solitary for months at a time. Tending towards the remote places. I like to be in isolated deserts and sea coasts and just kind of strange offbeat locations and spend long periods of time alone. And what's interesting about that, though, is that you'll meet people at these places that you find yourself at the most random places. You'd be in a Dunkin' Donuts in a suburb of Portland, Maine, way away from a train hopping spot or a hitchhiking spot that's suitable, and you don't know why you yourself are there. And then you see somebody, you say, wait, did I meet you 4 years ago in Arizona? And they're like, yeah. You know, I've had weird things like that happen. But the dark downside of that is that I have a lot of people who I got close to, and I couldn't tell you if they're dead or alive, you know, and it's kind of bittersweet in that way. But one thing that I'll say too is that two things that I'll say is that I don't believe that you can be sedentary in the modern secular context, and you can be an atheist. You can lack a spiritual disposition, but I don't believe that as a nomadic person you could not experience some sort of a mystical expression of God. And I'll even go so far as to say, if you travel, you're going to experience the poverty of Christ on the cross at least a handful of times, and it's going to stick with you. So I think spirituality is a part of it for sure. But also, I'll say this too, is that the way that the word nomad is used, or maybe I would even say abused in the modern context, it sort of means, oh, somebody who just moves around, but they don't think about the shape of their moving around. Traditional nomads often might have run as narrow of a range as a single county within a
Right.
U.S. state.
Right.
They were not necessarily going all over the world as an isolated unit. And you find the larger a group to travel with, the more your range is going to shorten, because it's just hard logistically to move around with a dozen people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I guess gasoline engines have sort of made there be anthropological possibilities that didn't exist prior to Henry Ford.
Right.
But I'm not going to take those as a foregone conclusion going into the future, except in the most limited capacity.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you want to get down to the nitty gritty, I am a big advocate of 49cc engines. They travel slowly. They're extremely fuel efficient and almost totally unregulated in the vast majority of U.S. States and cities and such. So I think there might be some future there, going into the future, especially you see the price of gas.
Yep.
I don't know, but
Make little vehicles out of these tiny engines and move slowly around. I know, Andy, also you've kind of invented some vehicles, and you're always kind of posting about different modes of transport, including these like houseboats, basically, you've been posting about recently. Let's hear about these different visions. I guess nerdier people would call it like solar punk or something, but this kind of these different explorations you've done with transportation.
Well, I'll say the DMV is the mortal enemy of any freedom-oriented human being in the United
You know
States. And
what, like between you with the DMV and Keturah with like Social Security, like we're just this podcast is just on so many watch lists. But anyways, continue.
but I had numerous phases here. My most idealistic phase, when I was about maybe 20 or 21, I was designing and building bicycle towed mobile homes. And the bicycle obviously is a zero gas cost, almost zero maintenance cost, no registration, no license, no insurance, but you still can move a greater cargo load than you might imagine. So I was fabricating aluminum trailers and using polyiso rigid foam board to build basically a coffin-like structure that was so well insulated it didn't even need to be heated. And I lived in one of those for about 2 months. Well, actually, probably more like a collective 3 months between upstate New York and Western Massachusetts. But I tried devilishly to get others to do this with me, and nobody would bite. And I had these visions of buying plots of land along the 364-mile Erie Canal Trail and building hexagonal structures with like garage door ports that you'd back your trailer up to, and the middle of it would be like a common space, and we would split expenses. And at the time, I estimated for about $150 a month, you could really be living with all these people and moving freely and sort of making modular communes. I was obsessed with the idea until finally I just realized it wasn't going to be workable just then. Maybe today it would catch on more. And then I got into adding 4-stroke engines with belt drives onto recumbent bicycles. And I rode from Las Vegas to Mexico the day after the Las Vegas shooting. I had built a recumbent tricycle with one big wheel in the back and two small wheels in the front with a Honda GX38 4-stroke engine, and down. It was like a space pod. And so I'm zipping down Highway 95 there after the shooting, and it was totally nutty. So I did that, and then boats are another avenue. There's a lot of waterways that are heavily overregulated now. It's not strictly legal to float down the Mississippi in a raft, like Huck Finn style. In fact, they really don't like to see you do that. There's a lot of people who tried and failed, including Grimes. Grimes, when she was a teenager, Claire Boucher, she tried to go out of St. Paul, Minnesota, and it just didn't work
Oh,
because
really?
the
That
cops
makes me like her, actually. I love that.
yeah, it's kind of cool. But I think of the Erie Canal a lot because I'm an upstate New Yorker and I love upstate New York. And the Erie Canal is practically unused and there's practically no liveaboards. And if you call the Canal Corporation and ask them, what are the regulations about liveaboards and how long they can stay, they sort of laugh at you and they're like, I don't care what you do on the canal, So there's this kind of anarchic possibility. And then recently I found a guy, an RPI professor. He built a purely solar powered canal boat that is a liveaboard canal boat, and he transited from Albany to Buffalo on the Erie Canal with zero gasoline expenditures. And I looked at that and I said, I'm not a big fan of solar, but I am a big fan of free motion that is unregulated by the state and federal governments. And so that's a possibility. I've been emailing him actually about it, and he sent me some schematics about how his motors are set up and things. So I may experiment with that this upcoming summer.
Oh, that's so fun. Oh my gosh. Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, I just would like to make an observation that mostly hippie, punk, anarcho, whatever type people tend to have like very little agency. And so your unique combination of like having this like alternative point of view, but like muscling through ambition and agency is so cool to see, and probably why you haven't like had as much success doing these modular communes is because you need to find other people like that who are like really, willing to put their values into the real world, like muscle it into existence. And part of the nomadic thing and the like anarcho, anarchist point of view is you really do have to have quite a bit of agency, like just muscling through so many regulations, figuring out places to go. This is why there's all these like underground anarchist cookbook, like you have to share hints with people, places to go, ideas to that worked, because it really is not so easy to push back against the state. The modular communes thing is so cool, and something Adam Van Buskirk, Empty America, tweets about sometimes is the idea of like, you should be able to buy a subscription to a hotel, and then whatever city you're in, you can use that hotel chain. But this would be like the low end, more rugged version of that, where you just like show up and you're like, I know that I'm welcome. And it's kind of like a brotherhood where you're like, as long as you follow X, Y, and Z rule, you can roll in with your whatever vehicle and find a place. And it's actually, I don't know if you know much about the history of the different like hobos during the Great Depression, but Patrick's dad was a train. He worked in trains in that, or his grandpa, sorry, worked in trains in the Great Depression, and talked to him about all the different rules. Like different houses would have a little mark on them saying who was welcome. Yeah. Like people would come, you could come to work. Hobos welcome here, or we'll be able to provide you with a hot meal if you need to. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I had a separate question for Keturah, but maybe we can talk about the hobo as a precedent, the Great Depression as a precedent first, and then I have a feminine question for Keturah.
Oh.
Well, my great grandfather was a hobo in the Great Depression and an immigrant from Scotland. And so it sort of, I don't know, I take a special interest in it, I guess. The only one of those, the old hobo code is really cool, but there's only one symbol I know that's still used, and that's the, it's like an N in a circle with an arrow up the top, and that's for squatters. And squatters are sort of a corollary to this whole discussion because, like you say about people who have agency, there's two types of squatters. There's the squatters that like to do heroin and fight with the cops, and they're just living a completely chaotic, hellish life. And I've stayed with some people like that. I used to squat with some people like that in New Orleans. Um, and then there's the squatters who are the legal eagle, who can snoop out unclaimed properties and inhabit them on the slick and do everything that they need to do to eventually establish title to the property. And those are the types of people who are pouring through the state regulations, and they're doing the paperwork, and they're putting the notices in the paper and all this stuff, and you don't even know they exist because they're so good at what they do, So I think that same model is present in almost all these alternative, like hobo adjacent cultures.
Yeah.
There are really good hobos that you wouldn't even know that they're riding trains because they're just good at it.
Yeah.
And then there's the hobos that will end up getting fights with the cops every night, and they just get a thrill from it because they don't believe in anything, and they have a very low life expectancy, abysmally low. I've known a lot of them who are now dead.
Yeah.
So
and it's actually interesting. Like, I think a lot of people think nomadism is cultureless, but it's not at all. There are subcultures, there's super functional cultures within it, there's less functional, less healthy. But there is a vision of a more functional hobo culture, even one where settled people accept hobos in for a day's work. And like a modern version of this, it sounds stupid, is like these work away programs or work on organic farm programs, where it's like you get, the idea is you get to stay here in return for work. We explicitly say what the work is. You get meals and you get a warm place to sleep. And it's a way to travel. It's a way to experience things. And there's just a sort of like set culture, set rules, expectations. And it's beneficial for everybody. So I think it's cool, and we should riff on that a little bit. But the question I have for Keturah, and I guess this is like one way we could riff, I can see kind of this like masculine and feminine sides between the two of you. Andy, this like wild, seeking wilderness, seeking solitary, like lone wolf, like, the male tigers, they just kind of like travel solitary over huge spots, areas. And the females like have shorter distances, but are more like community based. You have to take care of the kids. So the kids determine your ability to move, and you need, protection and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm curious, Keturah, if you have any thoughts on like the role of family, the role of children. And actually, before you answer, in this book, which I think everybody should read, and maybe we should read before we hang out at the Front Porch Republic conference, or I could bring it. One of the theses of this book, it's drawn on anthropology, is that civilized set or nomadic society would have like longer birth spacing and more extended breastfeeding, partially because women's ovulation was suppressed both from the breastfeeding and the constant movement, and because kids can't really walk on their own at the speed of adults until they're like 3. And so the idea being, like birth spacing gets determined by the movement. And then that has all sorts of implications about how the kids were raised. Whereas in settled society, you'd have excess calories, which you could then turn into food for infants starting at like 6 months. And so then you could get pregnant again, and then you're not moving as much. And then there's this whole like period of time in civilization where babies are, basically left alone. In some ways, I would say like traumatized by some of the behaviors of, what needed to be done to have closer birth spacing and having to do agriculture, whereas opposed to the nomadic, like original affluent society, you'd actually have a lot of free time. If you're just like hunting and gathering, and there's a lot of time where you're just kind of like able to focus on infants and, that kind of thing. So I'm super curious about that whole like motherhood, biology, these kind of the ways humans have evolved to raise babies. But anyways, I digress. Keturah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on family and nomadism. Like, I know that you grew up moving with your or not moving, but traveling with your family and accepting travelers within your family. And in some ways you say, okay, maybe there were some risky moments where maybe or it was like a lot of people in one place. But then, there were positive aspects of that as well. So I'd be curious to hear the feminine.
Yeah, I always liked it when there's a lot of people in one place, and even the risky situations that we went through taught all of us kids how to be like at least more thoughtful and more discerning. So I don't think any of the experiences we had were like
Traumatic
experiences I repeat. Yeah. I mean, what does trauma mean? Everyone's got trauma and something how to deal with, and other people are wimps.
Yeah.
But and I guess
it's like traumatic enough that you learned something, got tougher, but not so traumatic that it shut you down. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I guess part of it is like my philosophy about it is I don't think to be feminine means that you want to have a whitewashed kitchen and you want a very easy lifestyle and that you need like a steady access of what like cheese and crackers and all these like prepackaged snacks. Like that's not femininity in general. And even like it depends on how you define traveling. Like a lot of people think of traveling as a way to run away from their problems, but like the etymology of traveling literally is like traversing, which has direct connections to like a woman being in labor, like the travails of labor and traverses. And so if you're traveling and you're into traveling, then you're putting yourself in this mindset of like the pilgrim, of like being like the Christian or like the woman or the man that you're supposed to be, and you are running toward the things that you need to be running toward, not away from them as like a lot of, but like I have ideas that basically like if I'm willing to accept the traverses of life and the pains that come with it, then that's going to make for a good family. And like also like I definitely feel like I'm like we both have a little bit of a different style of traveling. I'm gonna have a lot to learn from that because I'm just used to like getting in a car and camping in a car, and he's got all these other ways of traveling that I'm excited to like figure out just what they are, because like I would never have been brave enough to do them by myself. And some of these things I've like, oh, this would have been fun, but now like I actually get like the opportunity to try to do them. And yeah, and I don't have a focus. I feel like a lot of women also like femininity in general, I don't think is defined by like needing to be safe or needing to have like things clean and perfect and in order, but it's like being open to change and being open to whatever life brings towards you, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And being open to doing things that are scary. And I don't need safety, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's not that I'm anti-safety, but I'm anti doing things for the reason of it being safe, kind of thing. If it deters from other things. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And I'm curious, Andy, if you have thoughts on these polls, the masculine and feminine approaches to traveling, to nomadism.
Well, I guess the question really transcends nomadism, because like it makes you reflect on man and woman, why God made man and why God made woman and how they interplay, and to realize that a man is highly capable if he's a man of experience who's gone and tested things and taken risks, which is what any man in his 20s really has a responsibility, I think, to do that for himself and push the envelope and scare himself a little bit so that he knows that he can do things. That quality is worth a lot, but it's worth less absent a woman after a certain point. I've seen a lot of men who just can't get it together enough, or they can't relent in their ways enough to let a woman in, and they wind up destroying themselves. And whether that's dying by the highway with a needle in your arm, or whether it's kind of going insane, as you probably are familiar with some of these the expat cultures that are really like not so wholesome. In Southeast Asia. I've known guys that go to Cambodia and drink themselves to death. And I've known people who just wind up going back home and hoarding massive piles of tools and wood and scrap metal, and their house is fallen in, and they've got no get up and go that a woman unlocks in a man. And so I think that the agency that you were mentioning earlier is only exponentiated by the two of us coming together and marrying one another and committing to one another. And I'll say another thing too is on the topic of security. It's not like men don't need it either. But the nomad's security comes from extreme loyalty that is actually alien in settled society. Settled people don't really understand that when you are traveling with somebody and you cultivate an atmosphere of mutual respect, you are entrusting yourself into the hands of another in potentially life or death situations that the person who goes from Planet Fitness to Panera to the office to their apartment, they just never ever see it, you know. And so the conception of friendship, it's very difficult for me to be friends with people who are just sort of living a normal life, because to me, friendship is of the blood. Friendship is, I would spill my blood for you, which also ties in with Christianity and a mystical experience of Jesus Christ as he presents himself to those who take those kinds of risks. So it winds up, a lot of the anthropology, I can't contrive it in my head. A lot of it is natural and original and built into the human person who puts themselves in a particular type of situation.
Mm-hmm. And I would say the same goes for women too. Like if a woman continues to travel on her own for too long, she loses her beauty. She loses the femininity that was like innately in her spirit, and she loses like the focus of why she was traveling. She no longer is focused on like, oh, I'm doing this to like find the spirituality I was looking for. I'm doing this to like make myself a better woman. Eventually she gets to a point where she either has to accept the message that traveling has been speaking to her, or she speaks to a different part of herself that says, oh, I want to hold on to this freedom and I want to hold on to myself. And then you completely, again, lose focus of why traveling was good. And you get into this rhythm of only like loving traveling for the sake of traveling instead of like actually loving what you could have gotten from that thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually very dangerous to be a nomadic type person. Like, I don't think you can actually be truly nomadic unless you sort of kind of give up some of your freedom and realize it's not about yourself.
Yeah. This is total, these two poles, another two poles are this extreme safety versus like extreme risk. And I guess one thing that comes to mind is this, like, before we turn towards something more positive and optimistic, this psychotic response to Andy's tweets that suggest anyone could do anything outside of like Planet Fitness to Panera to your little box in a city as a life path. It's so disheartening. What is going on with these? Like, let's just dissect this really quick. What is going on with these people and their, like, if you suggest like, yeah, I mean, you don't need to be like the wealthiest person. Like, you're not actually that victimized. And think like victimized relative to the rest of human history or even the rest of the world. But there's something in this like victim mentality that really robs people of agency. So let's talk about that just briefly, just because I know you've made such a splash with these tweets.
A lot of the different tweets have done it. I have thought a lot about it, and it actually troubled me greatly when I put out the Lansford, North Dakota post about buying a $15,000 house, and everybody was crying about it. I think we're at the point in Western culture where the psychology of leftism has infiltrated everyone's mindset practically, regardless of whether you express by the light of day a right wing or fascist or an anti-communist politic. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because actually a lot of the people who were my greatest detractors were not leftists. They were fascists.
Yeah, in name though, but by leftism, do you mean like grievance politics?
Grievance politics, exactly, because basically what it is now is there's an ecosystem of grievance, right? Where if people do not have the imagination to actually address their grievances by doing something radical, take the example of property taxes. Everyone loves to complain about property taxes, but if you suggest to them, why don't you consider living in a boat? They will laugh at you. They'll give you, oh, well, there's all these reasons. And if you're going to suggest that, then you need to tell me what I'm going to do for a bathroom and blah, 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 blah. It has to be a prepackaged deal. No, you have to think how do I live on a boat? Maybe it's possible. Maybe my blood pressure would go down if I wasn't paying so much for property taxes by living on a boat. But people craft identities around their grievances. And so therefore, there's people in the media, right, who they're selling anger. They don't want their listeners to stop being angry, because then they lose their clicks and their views, and the people themselves who are angry lose their identity, because it feels good to walk to Buffalo Wild Wings and say to your drinking buddy at a hockey game on TV, "Oh, I'm just so angry about those Dems and what they do," right? "Oh, I'm so angry about it." Yeah, me too. So now you have your tribe, right? You leave that behind the moment that you start to dream and do and actually outmode the impingements to your liberty that you see in the form of property tax or the housing market, or whatever it might be. So it just struck a nerve in people's kind of distorted psychology about their own plight, and it just baldly displayed they would rather cry about things than even mildly entertain any alternative to their way of life.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I know. Okay, so turning towards something optimistic, we talked a little bit about the nitty-gritty details, but if we wanted to like really paint a picture and envision an anthropologically informed, so this could be like pre-America or pulling in from some of the American examples of nomadism and traveling, what would we envision for, or like, let's paint a picture that's interesting, that's evocative. And I would just say, I've long thought that both men and women in their young life should have an adventure stage, whatever that means, because I think, like, at least in modern society, and if you're in, settled society, you're going to be mostly safe, mostly coddled. You do kind of need to get out of that and prove to yourself that you can do some things, prove to yourself that you can make it through interesting or difficult situations, prove to yourself that you can think on your feet, this kind of thing. Think for yourself, that your agency and thinking could like lead to practical abilities to survive in the real world. Like, I think so many people just don't even have that experience where you're like in a crazy situation and you say like, I've got to like, if I don't think of something, I'm going to be very hurt, or this is going to be a very dangerous situation, and you have to figure your way out. And then I think people should take that. I personally think, this is, my opinion, should take those lessons from that adventure stage. And like you said, both of you, like, it's like relenting to a marriage, but it's also leaning into your agency in a different way, where you're maybe slightly more towards the safe end of things, especially if you're thinking about kids and making like a stable environment for them. But what you're building together is bigger than anything you could do like with your individual agency and your adventure stage in the world. And I think a lot of people don't really realize that, like, the power is not just 2 times with 2 people together. It's much more than that. And then you're bringing 2 clans together, potentially 2 families, and then all the agency that comes with all of those relationships and experiences and connections to place and whatever. So that has nothing to do with nomadism except for the adventure part. But I was just, just trying to paint a picture, I guess, for people of like, all right, let's really lean into some kind of future orientation. Like, what could it look like? What could it be like?
Well, I think that there's so many possibilities, right? Like, if you talk to continuous narrow boat canal cruisers in England, and you said, "Oh, there's, what is it? It's thousands of miles of inland waterways in the United States where almost nobody is living on board their vessels," they would be shocked,
Yeah.
right? They'd be shocked. How could it be that they have these wonderful canals and nobody's built narrow boats and is living on them? And if you talk to Qashqai nomads from Iran and you said, "Oh yeah, 10% of the surface area of the United States is BLM land where you can camp for 2 weeks at a time, and you legally only move a quarter mile every 2 weeks, and you'll be good to go, and you could bring your goats as well," they would be shocked. How are there not nomads who are doing this, right?
I love this vision.
So I think that we're almost in like the perfect environment where the potential nomadic culture, there's just millions of possibilities. I mean, and I think of some of them too are a little more tame and run a shorter range and would be more conducive to families. Like for example, it's not hard in the real estate market to find odd shaped parcels in rural areas for tiny sums, right? I've found properties in upstate New York for $2,500 for 3/4 of an acre way up a dirt road or walk-in access only. If you owned a lot of these properties and you cycled through them seasonally, and maybe only one or two of them actually had a legal structure to live in for more than a couple weeks, you could run a range like that. I've also thought about if you could outfit mopeds with diesel engines. This would take some mechanical skill. You could run an a plant oil based system with those diesel engines. You could ride the Appalachian Mountains seasonally with the wild nut harvest and bring along a nut sheller and an oil press and press your own fuel oil from oaks and hickories that you put into your moped to continue to go to the next place. Why couldn't you do this? This is probably physically possible, although nobody's ever done it before. Or you could live on BLM land. You could live in boats. There's just a million different possibilities there. And really it's going to come down to, I can't answer the question in specific detail.
Yep.
What it's going to come down to is a group of people who see this vision as being possible and desirable on a multi-generational basis. They're going to have to congeal at some point and have some great gathering where they brainstorm these kinds of things. And there's got to be a way to filter out all of the drunkies and the bums who might want to be hangers on in such a thing. You need high agency people to sort of be the founding generation of such a thing. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if it's even the right historical moment for it, but it's worth propositioning people wherever I go and just feeling it out and seeing if there isn't a sort of a market for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this so much. I cannot explain to you how much I love this. I especially have been thinking a lot about I think like so when I first got on Twitter, I was interacting with a lot of people who were like, we need to reinvent X or Y, like let's really lean into like, technological futurism, whatever. And I think that people's utopian impulse to have a hard break from the past is very unhealthy. And I like thinking about the ways in which you can bring the past and some kind of heritage forward into the future and learn from the past, but then make a modern iteration of it. So what you're describing is just like the, different Native American tribes and their movements seasonally and the ways in which they moved and interacted with the landscape was like bioregional. It was dependent on watersheds and harvest schedules and bison population and all of this kind of thing. And the other thing that came out when you were speaking just now is also I taught this I organized this homesteading 101 class, and one of the insights from the class is there's no such thing as like, you can't just like order a pig in a box. You have to look at your own land and figure out like what land you have, what's its carrying capacity for feed. You have to set up an area for where the pig can stay. Like there's no standardized answer. The answer lies in the agency of the human interacting with the environment. That's it. That's the only way to get to the answer is to figure it out yourself. You can get tips from people, you can get best practices, you can get ideas of what worked for them, but fundamentally, like you're going to have to take all of that input and make the decision yourself. And so, so I love that part of it too, because it's like the future kind of belongs to high agency people, who are willing to muscle through and figure out a cool way to exist and a fun existence too. I feel like there's just so much malaise that it's really fun and generative to talk about these things. What else have we not talked about that you feel like we should get on the record? Because this has been such a good demonstration of both of your points of view. What else do we need to get on the record before we go? What else do we want to talk about?
Well, I think sometimes there's going to be a little bit of a different focus too between the two, because he's going to be thinking about bikes and like where to stay through the night. I'm going to be thinking about fruit and clothing and books and
yes, yes,
you know,
yeah,
and that's why we are stronger together, because like we're able to like put a little bit more focus in a little bit more niche areas in a way that makes the whole thing more beautiful and more sustainable.
totally.
Yeah.
I'll also say, just sort of as a corollary to my detractors on the internet and all of this sort of the whining industrial complex, I think that it's worth mentioning. Look at this situation in North Africa. What populations in North Africa have been a consistent thorn in the side of the powers that be? Overwhelmingly, you look at the wars in and around Western Morocco, or you look at the Tuareg people, the Fulani people, the Bedouins, and you look at some of the Islamic terrorists in northern Mali in the Sahara. These people are nomadic. These people have a tremendous amount of power because they can sort of be almost on some Sun Tzu level. The enemy advances, I withdraw. A nomad can do that 100 times better than somebody who says, I'm going to stand and fight. And if they come knocking, then I'm going to shoot them. It's like, that's never going to happen because the powers that be know not to do this one thing that would not work well for them. So they're going to stonewall you out in every other single possible way. Whereas if you're nomadic, where are they going to come knocking? There's nowhere to come knocking. So people who express a political vision of change, and if you have a political desire, that means you want power. The 20th century model of, I have a political desire, that means I'm going to vote about it, has already really been disproven as frankly idiotic in my opinion.
Yeah.
And so if you have a political vision, it means you want power, and it means that you must embrace the structural elements of what makes you able to exercise your power. And nomadism is a great way to go. If you're riding around the desert on dirt bikes with a bunch of guns, you can shape the future in a way you can't if you didn't. And so I find it interesting that the people who are the most politically angry snub their nose at these ideas, because really if you could assemble an army doing this, you would have a lot of power. I'm not saying I'm going to go and do that, but that's a territory that I think will get interesting this century as the political climate of this country gets worse and worse. There's a power vacuum in our western deserts that will probably be filled. And I'll say too, I mean, a lot of this stuff, I get better ideas for how to move and where to camp and what vehicles to use if I'm not eating cold beans from a can and drinking whiskey in the bushes by myself. So having Keturah in my life is probably going to make things a lot easier, and this will probably be a period of great fruitfulness for the both of us. And mostly I like doing things like this and tweeting on Twitter, and now I'm making weekly posts on my Substack, mostly just to find other people who want to enter that era of fruitfulness with us. So I'm very interested in having conversations with new people about these ideas, because I think it's not just about me and my ideas or Keturah and her ideas. We're tapping into a something in the zeitgeist that hasn't had a forum for being explained, or acted upon.
Yeah, totally. I would just add one little comment. I didn't ever think about this before, but this is where like prepping meets nomadism, which is like being able to move around is a risk mitigation strategy. Thinking about like having a bug out location, having a place where you can go where you can be safe. Like one of my biggest concerns, and I'm moving back to Chicago, and it's one thing I'm worried about, is is being around unprepared people. Like being around people who don't have any skills in uncertain times, people really freak out. And being like in a dense city in that situation, I would have to have, I plan to have, and we're keeping this property in Uruguay as a extreme bug out location, but also as like a legacy property for my family. But having these like spots and places where you can go and be safe. They can't, people, this is a good risk mitigation strategy, I think. Okay, so this is so fun. Where can people find you? What's the name of your Substack? What's your Twitter handles? And we'll put those in the description too.
So you can find, I'm leaning more towards Substack recently because I like the longer format, and I would direct anyone who's interested in what I do to shagbark.substack.com.
Okay. And Keturah?
They can find me on Twitter at Keturah Abigail. At Keturah Abigail. And I also have a blog, but it's kind of been like, since I've met him, I really haven't posted on it very much, but I do plan to change that hopefully soon.
Yeah, and
my blogs are also.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
My blog is The Social Porcupine, and it's on Substack and it's on Blogspot.
Okay, and are you still planning to run your Living Room Academy still, or was that like a summer initiative?
It was, I started before I met him, So yeah. I've got to figure out how to redirect that vision so it works for the both of us.
Okay.
I will continue to teach skills no matter like where life takes me in any way. Like right now I'm packing like a little suitcase of sewing things to take on our next travels with us. So I'll probably end up like teaching little workshops throughout the winter here or there, just like at different events we go to.
All right.
But I don't know exactly what the Living Room Academy will look like. But my whole philosophy of the Living Room Academy is your living room, and the way that a woman can perform hospitality is wherever she's at. Yeah. And even a lot of people so I moved a lot as a kid, and traveling like gave me stability. And like I also relate to a lot of girls. Like a lot of girls who came to my course were girls whose families had moved a lot. And traveling also gave them that sort of stability, because in your travels, you can find you can have your home with you wherever you're at. Like, a mobile home of sorts.
Yeah.
And just like learning how to pack in a way where you can still like do the things that you love and like not always feel like you're being uprooted.
Yep.
I don't know. I want to somehow like keep that vision no matter where my living room ends up being next summer.
Yep. I love that. Yeah. And actually some of my favorite experiences traveling were really like hospitable moments. There was a moment where I was in Morocco on Eid, and every store was closed. It's like, the biggest holiday. And this guy saw me and my boyfriend on the street. We were like, are there any stores open? And he was like, just come, for this holiday, we're required to share. Everybody's required to like slaughter a lamb or sheep and share some of it with somebody and show some hospitality. So we're like in the backyard of somebody with a newly slaughtered sheep hanging up, waiting for it to get grilled. And I was like, oh, this is so lovely. It really makes me, grateful for human spirit. But okay, so follow Keturah on Twitter. She'll probably post about upcoming classes. Follow Andy at his Substack. We'll provide links. And thank you both. This was lovely.
Yeah, thank you.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
So fun.
Yeah, thanks.